All right, we are now live. It's a Saturday late morning when I would ordinarily be shooting some video stuff, and I am shooting video right now, right? Because this is a live feed that'll go to the channel. But had something big yesterday, the airing of the first episode of Wisdom for Life radio show, which I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. People have been asking to see my hair down. I usually have got it pinned back, so I thought I would do that today. You can see it's quite long, and you can see why I keep it pulled back most of the time, because there's an awful lot of it, and it can get in the way quite easily. So let me actually knock out some questions right at the start. Lenny Penny has a meta question, so you will not answer our questions. Yeah, I'll answer questions. This is a Dr. Sadler philosophy pop-up. It's like any other live thing. Usually I've got a topic in mind that I'm going to talk about, and that's the Wisdom for Life radio show and the experience of going on air and all that. But yeah, I'll answer questions. And I should answer one right at the start. Nazim asks, is there a way for non-Americans to listen to your Wisdom for Life radio show? Of course, because like every other radio station, River West Radio has streaming online. And all you got to do is click on the show page that's in the video description, and you'll be taken to it. And you can even hear it when it's not airing, because they archive their stuff in SoundCloud. So, I mean, that's pretty much, I think, the standard these days for most radio stations. You can stream them pretty much anywhere. Apparently, you can also listen to it through a smart speaker. Although if you say River West Radio, it will take you to some other River West thing. So you don't want to do that. You want to actually use the station letter identifiers, which are WXRW, I think, WXRW, River West. Or you can listen, I think, on satellite radio even, although I'm not quite sure about that. So it's kind of a cool era now as far as radio goes. There's very few people who actually listen to radio live when it actually happens, compared to the worldwide replay audience for that, and that's kind of cool. So I'll answer some of these other questions in a bit, but first I'm going to tell you a little bit about the show. So my co-host is Dan Hayes, and he is a guy who is he works in the tech fields, really into Stoicism. And he is one of the co-organizers of the Milwaukee Stoic Fellowship. So we got to know each other quite well. He spoke at StoicCon X Milwaukee this last year. He was one of the invited speakers. And, he and I have gotten together a lot of times, and we thought about the idea of doing a podcast. And there's so many podcasts out there that we thought, maybe not. And River West Radio is a community radio station. So that means you think about like national public radio and all the local affiliates, and now go even further down that line. NPR is still kind of commercial compared to community radio. Community radio, and there's not a lot of stations out there like that, means that within reason, anybody can do a show. But you have to actually underwrite the show yourself, or find sponsors or stuff like that. So there's a lot put on the producers. Nobody's an employee except for the station manager and a few other people. And everybody is essentially coming in and volunteering to produce their show. You've got to make some commitments so they don't get in trouble with the FCC, right? You can't say the 7 words that you can't say on the radio, and there's other things that are involved as well that you have to get training in. But the shows can be basically about anything, although they're sort of tapped out on sports shows, music shows, and I think maybe one other type as well. But nobody had ever pitched a philosophy-focused show. So that's what we thought, yeah, maybe we'll do that, because the station manager had been asking me for a while, hey, are you interested in doing a show or not? So I said, yeah, okay, maybe. And then with a co-host, okay, it's a little bit easier to do the show when you're not the only person on deck for it, right? So Dan and I went in and we pitched the show idea that we would be doing something that had to do with philosophy, but in a popular sense, how to apply it. We'd be going into some rigor, but we would be explaining terms as we went along so that somebody who doesn't have a background would easily be able to get some benefit out of it. And they said, yeah, sounds good. And then they said, okay, you got to sign up for the training and sort of, it's almost like a certification process. So we had to learn about, all these different FCC issues and regulations and what not to do. And we also had to learn about the ins and outs of the soundboard and all of those kind of things as well. So yeah, a lot of fun. And then we had our last show, or our first show last night. And it went okay. There were a couple hiccups at the start. Dan, who's actually better on the soundboard at this time, I think he forgot to bring a level up or something like that, which is really easy to do. So one of the other station people came in and helped us out. And, we had a good conversation. We had some things planned out ahead of time. If you listen to the show, you'll hear that we're talking about, what the show's about to begin with, because it's the first show. And then we talk about why philosophy is becoming more and more popular in across the world. And I think the internet has a big role in that. I mean, think about what we're doing right here, right? None of you would be able to hear what I have to say, and I wouldn't be able to see what you have to say if it weren't for this platform that we're on right now. So I think that's a huge thing. Then we talked about the notion of philosophy of life, or philosophy as a way of life, sorry. And, a little bit of Pierre, Hadot, and, talking about ancient philosophy, but also, existentialism. Even Descartes is really philosophy as a way of life if you read them properly, and you're not just sort of reading textbook stuff. And yeah, we went through that, and then we talked about the notion of philosophical practices, and we took a question about setting boundaries and, whether one could do that as a Stoic or not, or whether it means letting people walk all over you. The answer is no, it's not. That's not quite true. And then what else? Oh, we finished up by talking about a philosophical practice, which is negative visualization, which is, it's not just the Stoics who practice it, but it's really core to Stoicism. And then we wrapped up. And so good first show in the bag. There were some sound issues at the beginning, but otherwise it was okay. And things went pretty well. I actually got video recording of it, so I'm going to be putting that up once I've got the video processed. And the other thing I'll say about the show, and then I'll start answering some questions, is a friend of mine, Scott Terulli, he did the music for it. So if you enjoy the intro music and the outro music, it was very Joe Satriani-esque. You might go over to Scott Terulli's website and check him out. He is a guitar professor at Berklee School of Music and a gigging musician. He's been, doing a lot of studio and gig work for years and years. He has his own band. He's got 3 albums. Really cool guy. He and I have been working together on different projects for about 4 or 5 years now. And we, when we get the chance, because he lives in Boston, we hang out as well. So that's kind of fun. All right, so let's see what people have to ask about. Lenny Penny, what does philosophy bring to self-development that psychology doesn't? Well, you got to define your terms, right? So who's philosophy, who's psychology? Obviously, a lot of psychology, you're probably thinking psychotherapy rather than just psychology, because that would include, like experimental psychology and all that other sort of stuff. It depends. If you look at the classical thinkers in psychology, many of them knew a lot of philosophy. Some of them actually were philosophers, like William James, for example, right? But a lot of people who get training today in psychology, they don't really understand the roots of their discipline very well. And they know the approaches that they use, but they don't understand sort of bigger picture stuff, or they've got kind of a hazy concept of that. Not saying that philosophers are necessarily better. As a matter of fact, I would say 90% of philosophers, in terms of academic philosophers out there, you wouldn't want to bring into the conversation because they only know their little thing as well. But if you do know, if you've read pretty widely in the history of philosophy, you see certain themes coming up over and over and over again. And if you've got a real interest in, say, virtue ethics, and not in an abstract way where, well, virtue ethics is one of the big three, different than deontology or Kantian, or utilitarianism, right? But you actually read the text and try to apply them and see what people who are committed to that do, which often includes borrowing some stuff from other moral theories. Then you're going to have a more comprehensive concept of the human being, which is also a reflexive concept because you're not a robot, you're a human being theorizing about human beings. And then you have a lot to offer to psychologists, but psychology also has a lot to offer to philosophy when it's done well, So, I've brought up this article over and over again, which you can find in Essays on Aristotle's Ethics by Leslie Cosman, on properly being affected, where, towards the end of the essay, or book chapter rather, Cosman is saying, okay, so Aristotle's doing this stuff that we've sort of interpreted out of his works in terms of moral development. And what else? What's missing in the picture? Well, psychotherapy could help out, spiritual direction and traditions could help out. And so, you want to think of these as sort of cumulative processes, but you really do have to specify which psychology are you talking about? CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, and other cognitive approaches. Maybe bringing Aristotle, the Stoics, some others into the conversation can be very helpful for them because while they drew upon that stuff, they also forgot a lot about it. And current therapists are not well trained in that usually. Positive psychology. I think that virtue ethics can be a great critique of that, as can more socially oriented philosophies that are kind of later on. You could think of Marxism, but you could also think of what's come to be called conservative liberalism, Mill, de Tocqueville, right? They all have interesting things to say about how the way in which society is organized modifies the ways in which we grapple with our ideas and habits and stuff like that. So, and all of them would be very critical of what we nowadays call positive psychology, which you can tell I'm not a big fan of. So, there's a lot there. And of course, there's been a long-standing interaction between not just Freudian psychology, but depth psychology in general and philosophy. So, there's a lot of ways to supplement them. All right, Forrest has an assertion here: to question everything includes questioning the validity of questioning everything. Yeah, and I think that a lot of people go through that phase early on in philosophy when they discover that. And there's all sorts of interesting linguistic tricks you can do like that, where there's some self-referentiality to it. I don't know if it's really the case that they all boil down to the liar's paradox. When I did my senior thesis back in '94, I argued that all truth self-referential statement groups could be either construed as a liar's paradox, which then could be modeled as a Möbius strip geometrically, or as mere tautologies. But I don't know if it's been a long time since I've looked at that stuff. John asks, how do I think philosophy helps with the COVID-19 crisis? I don't think it helps. I mean, are you asking how it could help? I don't think anyone's consulting philosophers about it right now, although we are actually, as part with the modern Stoicism team, we're looking at actually putting together some discussions about that. I mean, the best thing you can do with the crisis is wash your hands more often. I don't think you need a philosopher to tell you that, right? I mean, they can help you out figuring out why your disgust impulses are getting away from you, or why it's a bad thing to be withdrawing from anyone perceived as Chinese. But again, if you need a philosopher to tell you that, you're probably in pretty bad shape. But they may be consulted on some things. We can, I suppose we could say that epistemologists who are involved in social issues can certainly help out when people are claiming that the virus spread is a hoax and things like that. Maybe there's a role for philosophy, right? All right. So Ethan asks, how am I doing? Pretty good. It was cool to do the show. I'm still kind of excited about it. A little chagrined as well that the audio didn't work as well at the start, but those things happen. We're sort of getting our, as they say, sea legs. And I'm sure the next time around we'll have it better. But I'm glad that we had some great music to fill in the gaps before the mics were coming up. So, it's a good thing that we had that track by Scott Cerulli. Dale asks, I really enjoy learning philosophy, but it can cause a lot of anxiety. Any advice? So that I think is kind of a common issue. There's quite a few experiences in studying philosophy that I think many people have, and we probably don't talk about enough. And some of them can be anxiety producing. So think about what are the sources of anxiety? One of the biggest ones is, am I doing it right? And the answer is, well, yes and no. I mean, by whose criterion, right? And it's very common to have encountered philosophy in modes that pretend like they're philosophy with a capital P and telling you how to do it, but they're really just a tiny little sliver of the discipline. So, if you have a professor who's like, well, doing philosophy is done this way, and that stuff over there isn't philosophy, then you might feel anxious when you find yourself attracted to do stuff, in other ways. And that's, the cure for that is realizing that the person who told you that didn't know what they were talking about, and probably buys into their own nonsense that's the only way to do philosophy. Again, reading through the history of philosophy is a great remedy for that, because you see just how many legitimate ways philosophy can be done. Another big thing is people read the texts. I see this with my students, and I need to create some videos about this for my students, because they wind up getting quite anxious about this. Reading philosophy texts is not like reading an encyclopedia entry or, more popular literature. You're not going to get it all the first time. As a matter of fact, you're probably not going to get half of what's going on in the texts unless you've been doing philosophy for quite a while. And even then, when I read something, I know that I'm going to have to go back over and over and over and over again. And so, that's okay. That's normal. You don't really master philosophy. I know a lot of people look at philosophy as if it's something like coding, where you can get your certification in this or that, and now you know all of this stuff because you've read through Spinoza 15 times, and memorized a bunch of terms. It doesn't work like that. Philosophy is a humanities discipline, and it's concerned with the deepest topics and with wisdom. So you're never going to master it, but you don't have to. So you don't have to place that burden on yourself. And then I think a lot of people get anxious about how well they can articulate what they think, and that's again, common experience. What else do people get really anxious about? Am I reading the right people? That's a variation of am I doing it right? Right? Because you can't read everybody, and knowing who you should read is, in large respect, it's not based on some sort of rational decision procedure. It's always based on some sort of trust or faith in somebody, right? So people ask me, who should I start with? And I start with Plato, right? And then they'll say, yeah, but I read Plato's dialogues and I didn't get anything out of it. Well, read them again, so-and-so said I should begin with Russell's History of Philosophy. Well, I mean, if you trust him or her more than you trust me, then go ahead and start with that. And a lot of it's experiential too. You read it, see whether you actually got something out of it, figure out whether you getting something out of it or not getting something out of it is a function of where you currently are or whether the text is any good. And then you move on and you hopefully bring the stuff with you. So all right, let's see here. Here we go. Alexandra asks, what do I think about Deleuze's difference in repetition? It's an interesting book. I'm not a huge fan of Deleuze, but it's worth a read. I mean, the books by him that I like the best are probably The Logic of Sense, and then his essays, Critical and Clinical. I think that's the English translation of it. And then, I like quite a few of his other studies. But he's worth reading. He's not. It's kind of weird that there's so much contemporary interest in him. I don't get it. I suspect a lot of the people that are really into Deleuze, it's sort of like the people who are into some of the other figures, because Deleuze is very difficult. I think a lot of the people who brag and talk about Deleuze probably don't understand Deleuze that well, because he's like deliberately unsystematic, right? He's going to subvert and undermine and all this sort of stuff and sketch out new possibilities. But I don't know. That's just sort of an aside. Social justice warriors of the world, quite a name there. How can you learn from your students and provide for their learning needs while also attempting to maintain rigidity? I wouldn't say you try to maintain rigidity. You try to maintain structure and substance and rigor, right? And I'm not particularly concerned with learning from my students. That I think that's kind of become a buzzword among educators. Oh, I learn more from my students than they learn from me. If that's the case, then you shouldn't be the instructor, right? I do enjoy like seeing them grapple with things, and I do learn from them in a way like, oh, well, here's a new way that we could apply Plato and this notion of the tripartite soul, because they're offering me an example I haven't seen before. But I think it's better to ask, how do you maintain openness so that students can explore and learn and find a guide that can help them with things, who's not like super hands-on, right? Not like saying, oh, you've got to go this way. But rather, well, what would be the benefit of going this way, doing that sort of thing and maintain all the other stuff. And my answer is that, well, I like to provide them with a lot of resources and then say, see what works for you. So, a lot of those core concept videos that I have in my channel, those are things I use in my classes for my students. And that's why, people are always like, why don't you do core concept videos on so-and-so? I'm like, I'm busy shooting stuff for my students right now, maybe after I get all of that done, I'll go to whatever it is that you're looking for. Or maybe I'll do something else, But yeah, the key is to try to meet the students where they are. You've got to be able to speak their vernacular, and not in the sort of Steve Buscemi, holding a skateboard, hat on backwards, saying, how do you do, fellow kids, sort of thing, right? Like that meme. But actually like staying interested in the big picture things that they're interested in, and exposing them to that. And that hasn't been an issue for me, really. Never assuming that the stuff that I'm into as cultural references is an automatic cultural reference for them. Like you always have to ask, well, what shows are you watching? And then maybe you'll find some common ground that you can use as examples. And I think the other thing in it too is we want to create lifelong learners. We don't want students who can simply get through a course and then do a brain dump of everything in their final projects or exams or papers, and then never think about this stuff again. We want the materials that we've had them engage with to leave, lasting traces on their soul, so to speak. And we want to gear them into like, well, where would they go for more information? So that's an important part of my classes when I'm doing it right. Some days I'm probably not. So, all right, let's look down here. Bruno asks, what are the benefits of studying philosophical works? What is there to be gained in so doing? Well, a wide range of stuff. I mean, if you're thinking about practical philosophy, you're getting suggestions that you can either follow or not follow about how to make your life less screwed up and how to understand your relationships and the world and the social matrix that we're in and technology and yourself and all of those sorts of things, right? That seems to me to be a pretty good thing. Some people are much more into like, well, no, philosophy is primarily theoretical or contemplative, and that's good too. I mean, there's lots of things you can think about in philosophy, and there's a wide range that you can select from. That's kind of nice as well. I'll tell you what, I mean, that makes me think of something. My instructors were so jaded in undergraduate that they would say things like, well, this idea will be useful for you when you're standing around with nothing to say at a cocktail party, and I mean, who goes to cocktail parties, right? I mean, we like picturing ourselves at a cocktail party and being like, yeah, I don't think I'm going to get invited to those sort of events. But the idea that you would use it for making like, what would you call it? Culturally literate idle chit chat to show that you belonged in a certain place. I suppose that you'd gone to college and learned certain concepts. It's so alien to the history of philosophy. Or it's not alien to it. That's exactly the sort of thing that, say, Descartes or Hume or Hobbes or others would have made fun of and said those are people who are their philosophy is no good. So all right. Hodisperlator, I guess, is the name. Hello, why do you think people enjoy philosophy and literature? Well, that's a vast thing. I think that you can say that people love stories, and a lot of good philosophy actually either has narratives or is in the form of narratives. Think about Aristotle's digressions. He loves to do that. Plato's dialogues are essentially narrative. Descartes' Meditations is a narrative. We could go on and on and on. And so there's that aspect of it. And people like thinking about ideas. People, the kind of beings that we are truth-seeking beings. Doesn't mean that we always find it, but we enjoy being able to make sense out of things. And again, Aristotle talks about this in the Rhetoric. We like to learn. Doesn't mean we all like to learn academic subjects. Some people like to memorize sports statistics and then rattle them off when they're hanging out at the bar with their buddies watching the game. And it's not just to make them feel like a big shot or to be able to have some sort of connection. It's also because they enjoy learning and understanding those things. So I think that's a part of it as well. All right. Mirak has a question about the phenomenology of spirit that I don't think I'll be able to answer on the fly. I want to ask about the phenomenology in paragraph 227. How does Hegel pass to priestly mediating consciousness from paragraph 226, where it comes from? I don't know. I have to go back to the text and look. It's not like I memorize Hegel and have him on tap in my brain, probably look in the paragraphs before that, or think about the fact that mediation plays a constant role in all of the dialectics, and then think about what Hegel's trying to get at there. I'm not quite sure why you're looking for that. Yeppe, what's your thoughts on Immanuel Kant's philosophy on radical evil? Well, Kant says that we can always go wrong. I think he's actually right. I think that acquiring the virtues makes us less likely to do that. But Kant isn't the first person to come up with this. I mean, John Cassian talks about cases of monks who lived this saintly life their whole life, and then like in the last year they just like go downhill and screw things up. And could be that they weren't living that saintly a life. We can't look inside their heads and actually see what their soul was. Maybe they were just trying to like be the saintly type or something like that. But Kant's basic point is that there's always the possibility of doing wrong. And for Kant, doing wrong isn't just like transgressing against the moral law. It would also include a sort of, attitude that subordinates the moral law to something else, like say getting rich or, satisfying your desires. So I guess you could say my view on it is he's right. But it's not a strictly Kantian thing. He just has that term. Lenny says, I look like a medieval king with my hair down. Okay. I don't have all the other accoutrements of a king, like a crown, or what is that thing that they, like an orb with the stuff that they'd have, or a scepter, or any of that sort of stuff. Andre asks, any thoughts on Pierre Hadot? Yeah, I think Hadot's onto stuff. Again, I don't think what he's doing is really original. He's sort of realizing things that other people in the 20th century were writing about quite a bit. They just didn't call it by the same name, and Hadot became popular, and they are forgotten or less so. Maurice Blondel, his first book, Action, 1893, says that philosophy is essentially about putting things into practice, right? Gabriel Marcel said that. We can go on and on and on and on. And Hadot himself says, ancient philosophy was understanding philosophy as something that's lived, having, a set of practices that are connected with experiential things, with texts, often with communities. But he also sees that happening at a lot of other points in philosophy. And he talks about, existentialists as being like that. So it's good to read Hadot. I think a lot of people, this is very common in the history of ideas. A lot of people like latch onto something. They're like, oh my God, this is the new thing. And look at how brilliant this is. And nobody's ever said this before. And then when you read around a bit, you're like, yeah, he's saying the same thing as all these other people were saying. So that's cool that he's bringing it back into the forefront, but let's not go crazy over this and pretend that like philosophy never knew this until this guy shows up on the scene. So all right, let's go on. Oswald asks, when can we expect the Philosophy of Iron Maiden book in the Barnes and Noble philosophy section? I don't know. Maybe somebody's working on that. I don't, I'm not going to be the one who does that. I got enough other projects. I actually had an interesting conversation about a week and a half ago with the head of the Marquette Institute for the Advancements of the Humanities, James South, who actually does quite a few of those popular culture books. And I asked him, has anyone done a Venture Brothers and philosophy book? And because I haven't seen one coming out, and I really like the Venture Brothers. And he said, no. And as a matter of fact, I pitched it and they turned it down. So I don't think there will be a book. And I was like, oh, that sucks. Because, that's the sort of thing I'd probably want to contribute a chapter to. Is there any chance that they'll reconsider maybe after another season comes out? He says, I don't know. We'll have to see. You could put out like different bands and philosophy. I suppose Iron Maiden would be kind of fruitful for that, but I got to say, a lot of the popular culture studies people, to me, I don't really enjoy their stuff. I find it kind of faddish. So I could just imagine what all the hipsters who want to write about Iron Maiden would submit. So, yeah. All right, Sean Hamill, how do you deal with philosophers who say the history of philosophy is pointless? I'm doing a PhD in philosophy, one with historical influence, and I'm getting annoyed at hearing this. Well, you can just say to yourself, well, that person's a dummy. They don't know what they're talking about. You don't have to say it out loud, but you could just like say it in the back of their head because, I mean, it's just a stupid thing to say. And I think a lot of people say it out of cliquishness or insecurity. They don't understand a lot of, past philosophers, and so they just kind of dismiss it. But they don't know what they're missing. I don't think you actually need to try to like provide a response to them. I mean, the irony is most of the time the work that they're doing is so unimportant that they're not going to make it in the history of philosophy. They're going to be forgotten soon after they shuffle off whatever appointment they have, and they're not going to make it into the longer history. A lot of the better philosophers are very cognizant of at least some of the history of philosophy. So, Nubified Spartan, what are some of the key differences between the philosophies of Descartes and Aquinas? Well, I'll give you one. Aquinas is hylomorphic, body and soul go together, and matter and form. And Descartes thinks that they're two different kinds of substances, mind and extended substance. So there's one right there. All right, let's see. Fantasy World History Simulator. I've been reading Derrida, and I'm wondering what you think of his concept of sous-rature, writing under erasure. I think it's that one. I think is probably one that's probably not going to stick around. Derrida is one of these people who wrote a lot and introduced a lot of ideas, many of which are what Plato and the Theaetetus would call wind eggs, right? When he has Socrates talking about how he's a idea midwife, right? He helps people bring their ideas to fruition. And then we see whether they're living and can continue on their own, or whether they're what he calls, gets translated as wind egg, but we could also say miscarriage, right? And I think that probably, I'm just sort of picking a number out of the air, probably 85% of Derrida's various ideas are miscarriages. They're not going to go anywhere. You're not going to do anything with them. Talking about, for example, there's nothing outside of the text. I think people will still be talking about that, in the next millennium, if people are still around, and it'll be like, it'll be like, the equivalent of Cobblestone's History of Philosophy, the chapter on Derrida. Derrida introduced these ideas, and some people will still be getting some use out of it, just like we get a use out of, like, Heidegger's being towards death, right? That idea or that concept. But I think that a lot of Derrida's ideas are, and the same you can say for most of his generation. Foucault, probably more of Foucault's ideas are going to survive. Deleuze, Lyotard, all of that group. Dan the Man, have I been successful in getting friends or family into philosophy or philosophical pondering? No. Not usually. Not as like doing philosophy, but I do find myself surrounded by a lot of thoughtful people, and so there's a lot of room for, at certain points, saying, well, so-and-so talked about that, and it could be helpful for you to check that out or read it. I'll mention that with my kids. Like, neither one of them are going to specialize in philosophy, and I'm cool with that. I don't think that children have to, like, carry on the legacy of their parents. My oldest is looking at musical theater right now and probably going to school for that. And my youngest is right now wanting to be a quantum physicist, but I'm sure that'll change later on down the line. And I'm cool with them doing something else, because you can always go back to philosophy. And yeah, I have conversations with them where we'll talk about philosophical topics, but we don't sit down and read Plato or something like that. All right, I'm gonna skip people who've already asked quite a few questions and jump on other ones. Perobazione, why do you think Machiavelli deserves his bad reputation? Or do I think Machiavelli deserves his bad reputation? I don't think he deserves a reputation as bad as he's getting, right? And that reputation was there already, like in the 18th century. Frederick the Great wrote a book specifically called Anti-Machiavelli, right? So clearly there were a lot of people who did not like the implications of The Prince. I mean, there's actually some good stuff in The Prince. You know, he's got some interesting discussions of class dynamics, why the rich are usually going to be pricks and try to like control everything, and how the ruler has to like, you know, rein them in, and how the poor are not, you know, innocent lovelies themselves, and you know what you need to do. But it's you know, you can think of it as a book for crises. It's not really a book for how you ought to run your life, unless you want to, you know, be miserable and alienate all the people from yourself, which I think maybe some people on some level do. You know? So there's a lot of business people who like, they claim that they're reading Machiavelli and getting a lot out of it. Again, I think a lot of people talk about the books that they're reading or the authors that they're reading and only like pick up certain little parts of it. All right, Wiggly Shirt. How do I make the most out of a great work? Well, it depends on what great work it is, I suppose. You know, you should. I mean, I guess you can say there's some negative things, like don't speed read it. You know, don't try to read it to claim that you've you know accomplished it or something like that. If it's a great work, people have been going to it over and over and over again because there's a lot of rich stuff there, and so I think you're going to want to. You don't have to approach it like with some sort of reverentiality. Oh my God, it's the wonderful, you know, text of Aristotle. He must not be wrong on anything. But you know, you should approach it and say, well, I'm sure there's something here because other people seem to be getting a lot out of it. And you know, the closer you get in time, maybe a lot of things that we think are great works right now are going to turn out not to be quite so great 20 years from now. That's probably helpful. All right. MX25A. If I'm a diehard Ayer follower, can I say that human evolution is just a hypothesis open to debate because there's no way to verify it? So human evolution is just a fun fiction. I mean, I guess you could, but that'd be kind of a silly thing to do. You know, that's one of the things where you probably want to look at your motivations for that, right? And you also want to read the text, see what Ayer actually has to say about verification. Not all verification is exactly the same. Think about how you know, what sort of circumstances would lead you to say that something is verifiable in principle. I don't think Ayer would say that evolution isn't. Joseph March, what sort of moral frameworks do you follow? I'm a virtue ethicist, you know, and I'm eclectic in that. So, all right, let's see what just jumped. Let's see what we've got here. I'm going to scroll back up. I mean, let me point out too that I'm probably not going to get to everybody's questions because people keep adding more and more. All right. Cola. I was thinking lately about micro philosophies and whether or not they can exist. For example, can a philosophy of flossing teeth exist? It's sort of like the, you know, Aristotle talking in the Rhetoric about the person who came up with the panegyric about salt, you know. I guess, I mean, you could write a book about it. It doesn't mean that there's like a whole actual discipline about, you know, flossing your teeth. I wouldn't call it philosophy of, I would say philosophical approaches to X, you know, like, should you floss your teeth? You could look at that from an egoist perspective. I don't know. Do you want your teeth to fall out, or you want to, you know, keep them for a while? Well, if it's in your interest to keep them, maybe you should floss them, or do what I do, use a water pick, right? You could look at it from a utilitarian perspective. You could look at it in a deontological perspective. God gave you those good teeth, or the universe gave you these teeth. It's not rational for you to not floss and take care of them. But to have a whole philosophy of it, probably not. Although Google it, see if there's somebody out there who's got something on it. Here's a great question from Arturo. How should one deal with asshole professors or professors that don't teach well? You don't actually have much power as a student in relation to the professor. And it's good to make a distinction between people who just don't teach well because they're not very experienced in it, or they're kind of clueless, or they're not very invested in teaching, and then people who are actually genuine assholes and say take pleasure in humiliating students or assigning work that they know the students are going to do poorly with, or we'd have a lot of professors who have these sort of asides about they'd be very defensive about how important the stuff that they were studying was and how we wouldn't appreciate anything from it. And you could have a teacher who plays favorites too. That's a problem. I think that ventures over into the asshole not regime either. Region. There we go. As well. How to deal with them? Well, remind yourself that your main goal is to get through the class. That's a big one, and that you don't have to necessarily speak up for philosophy. You're not going to get any mileage out of confronting them, most likely. But it couldn't hurt to send an email to the chair and say, listen, I'm paying for this class. I'm not getting out of it what I want or what I was hoping for, not because the material is bad. As a matter of fact, I really enjoy this material, but this professor is not doing what he or she should. We actually had a professor who eventually got fired when I was in grad school, who was a terrible drunk, and only got fired because he went after undergraduate students, groping them. And then he got, we'll send you over to our branch school in Japan to sober up and learn not to do that, which didn't happen at all. And then he came back and kept doing it. And then, one of the undergraduates was like, hey, this guy was disciplined before and they didn't do anything about it. Let's sue the school. Then they got rid of him right away. But, you don't have to do anything like that. Just send an email. And, I would say in that case, you're probably not going to get out of the class what you want. And that's unfair. And it's unfortunate. But, the key thing is for you to get that information elsewhere. Right. All right. I'm going to skip over the Deleuze question because we talked about Deleuze before. Vishal asks, why do people level philosophers as lunatic creatures? I don't know that that's the case, so it's kind of a non-starter. Gambrick, I'm going to be TAing for the first time for a liberal arts math class next term. Should I try to make things clear as they make sense to me, or should I just follow the textbook and professor? Maybe both. Maybe that's something where you try to, and you could actually present it as well, I'm going to give you this first, and then I'm going to give you this first, and let's see if there's any contrast between those. That could be really useful for your students. And different students are going to benefit from different approaches. So I think that could be good. Factotum, I've noticed you've been delving into art theory lately. Any intention of making a video on Joseph Beuys and his social plastic sculpture? No. The only reason I've been talking about art theory is because I have a class, Ethics for Artists and Designers, and I was looking at a few things where there's some overlap there. The Tolstoy and Dickey and who else did I think that may be all that I actually hit on for the time being. Eventually, I'll probably put together a philosophical aesthetics class for Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design and shoot a lot of other core concept videos in aesthetics. But that's down the line. For the fall, I'm actually teaching world religions and a 15-week existentialist course for them. So, all right. Let's see. Just A, you often say we shouldn't buy a single philosopher's narrative on the history of philosophy. What do you think is the biggest flaw in the narrative presented in After Virtue? Well, and this is kind of a common thing. I think that MacIntyre, I think he writes off Hellenistic philosophy a little bit too easily, casting the Stoics essentially as precursors to Kant. There is something of that in there, especially when you look at like Cicero's On Ends, Book 3. But it's not a sufficient treatment. And A. Long wrote a great piece, from a MacIntyrean perspective, saying, really, you're saying Aristotle's the remedy to Nietzsche. The Stoics would also provide an equal, parallel track for that sort of thing. And MacIntyre is very clear. He says, "Listen, I haven't covered everything. Nobody actually can. We're past the time of Hegel where people thought you could, and there's going to be some gaps." So, yeah. All right. Let's see here. Heracles in. I'd like to ask what's your favorite method of taking notes and how important, if all, do you think it is? Taking notes is not that important for me. I take notes generally when I've got thoughts that I want to work out and plan to get to later, and very often I don't get to them. Or when I'm like in a like back and forth sort of thing and I need to actually take notes on what somebody's saying, or I'm having a session with somebody and I need to take notes, which is a different kind of note taking, or when I'm doing research that is going to culminate in a presentation or academic paper. And my ways of taking notes, I think, are pretty idiosyncratic and wouldn't be helpful for anybody else. Different people have very different approaches to that. So I don't have any like techniques or stuff like that with those sorts of things. Same thing with mnemonic devices. I don't really use them. I just rely on my memory. So I don't have anything very helpful to say there. All right. Chris Shuttleworth, I know you've stated your role as a historian and interpreter of philosophy more than an original thinker, which is cool, but what are your most proud discoveries in philosophy? Well, let me say right off the bat that originality is overrated, and that much of the people who are not doing history of philosophy are not doing original work. They're just regurgitating the same stuff over and over and over again. So it's not like, being a historian of philosophy versus being an original thinker. As a matter of fact, most of the original thinkers are pretty good in the history of philosophy. Great example of that would be Heidegger or Alistair MacIntyre, right? So it's a false dichotomy, and it's a dichotomy that's made by people who generally want to write off history. There are also some amazing historians of philosophy who come up with some very original ideas. Henri Gouillet is a great example in French history of philosophy, sort of mid 20th century thinker. Not everything he's written has been translated, unfortunately, but so this is not the sort of contrast that people make. I mean, in my work on Anselm, I think in some of the articles that I've got, I think I've managed to identify some interesting themes and come up with some useful turns of phrase to try to explain his rather complicated moral theory and views on freedom and causality. I've done things like that every once in a while with Aristotle, being able to identify Hobbes as having a totalitarian conception of reason, not just a conception of reason that can lead to totalitarianism, but something like that. There's things like that along the way, but here's something that I think gets left out. Good interpretation is a creative act. You're engaging with the subject and trying to give it new voice, new life. That's part of why I like doing translation work. I love taking somebody else's words and seeing if I can put them into something else. And again, I think that our conceptions of originality are quite often overblown. So, Montana, what exactly does Descartes mean by extension? Bodily substance, things you can measure. Just look and see what he says in the discourse and the meditations. He's got some treatments of that. Or you can go, if you want to the principles of philosophy. That's, by the way, the principles of philosophy, that's what Descartes was hoping was going to be the book that would, people would go to, right? It was going to replace the manuals in stock in the philosophical world of his time. It didn't really pan out like that so much. Joseph March, did I enjoy The Good Place? I watched the first few episodes with my wife. Neither of us enjoyed the first few episodes. We felt they were quite heavy-handed and the sort of stuff that you'd roll your eyes at. I'm told that it got better as things went on, but the things that people have told me about it makes it sound like it got not great better, but marginally better. I don't know if I have the time down the line, maybe I'll watch it, but I think there's enough people already doing work on that I don't need to bother with it. Right now we've been watching Better Call Saul. That's a great series, and nobody's like putting philosophy on the chalkboard, but they're doing a hell of a lot better job with ethics than I saw anything happening in The Good Life. So, also looking forward to Westworld coming out quite soon. So, yeah. All right. Made of Clay. I don't know what it means to love oneself when one can't mean it without lying. Been told before I'm loved by people who didn't mean it, and I don't want to do that to myself. How could it be authentic? Well, I suppose you could begin by, putting aside what other people have said in the past and realize that there's no intrinsic connection between what they've said and what you can say to yourself. So that might be helpful. And, it's not so easily done as said. Stuff is always going to come popping up, and it may even be like linguistic formulations that you hear in your head, what we call self-talk, and you have the choice to talk back to yourself and say, well, that's bullshit, or I'm putting that behind. Now, not loving oneself because you can't mean it without lying, that sounds sort of like you're struggling with, I don't want to say, oh, you're a great person when I think I'm not a great person. Okay, then you're not a great person. That doesn't mean that you're unlovable. That means that there's some things that are good and some things that are bad. And then you can identify and distinguish those things and congratulate yourself on the things that you've managed to do well. See if you can find things about yourself that you do like. And the things that you don't like, you have the capacity to change them over time, right? So if you want to be lovable and you find yourself thinking that you're unlovable because you lose your temper too often with people, start researching anger management. There's plenty of resources out there, or, there's all sorts of things that you can do along those lines, but you don't have to let other people's viewpoint on that drag you down. And authenticity is not something that you attain like flipping on a light switch. It's a gradual process. So you don't have to be authentic right now, Polygraph, what is national identity? Is it an artificial social construct or something else? Yeah, it's an artificial social construct. It's based on commonalities that people share, like coming from a certain area or having genetics in common or a language in common. But it's usually like 90% bullshit, right? I mean, think about American national identity and all the silly stuff that we associate with it, half of which isn't even true, and then a lot of which is kind of twisted around and the real story has been left out, Yeah, and I mean, that's not to say that we shouldn't care at all about our nation, but we shouldn't be invested in ideological conceptions of the nation. All right, let's see here. Moonchild asks, do I have students who take my class and continue to pursue philosophy? If so, do they catch up with you in your office hours to discuss other philosophers? Sometimes they email me. Sometimes they get in touch with me in other ways. I tell students as my classes end that when they find themselves using concepts from the class, I want them either to email me and to email me at my business address, because I might not be teaching at that place at that time, or to do it through LinkedIn. And I get quite a few who do. I also have quite a few students when I'm teaching like a survey class who say, what are you teaching next semester? And, at Marquette, oftentimes they'll say, I don't know, they may or may not have me teaching for them. If I am, it's probably business ethics. That's the only upper level class I teach for them. If it's Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, I have students who now have taken 2-3 classes with me, and I see them in the halls, and they don't really come to the adjunct office, but we chat about stuff when I run into them. So, and then I often see a lot of my students around town as well, which is kind of nice. Carthage, I've only been teaching there this is my second semester, so I don't really know that much about what's going to happen with that. So, all right, let's see here. Sean Hamill, there's a good question. If Trump refuses to give up power if he loses the election, would that be the beginning of the end for the American Republic? Would it be a Sulla or a Caesar moment? Yeah, I think you could say that. And there is a danger of that, and the danger doesn't just lie in Trump and his administration and the revolving door of, lackeys who go through it. It's in his base of pretty nutty people who I've seen, go from being halfway reasonable to being like, cult followers, who are, and some of them I have as family members, and you're like, man, this is a bad sign. If you know the history of totalitarian movements, and not just that, but also coups and how republics and democracies and any, let's just say, representative government breaks down, we're in a pretty bad place. So yeah, I think there's going to be some serious issues here. Carlos and Joseph say thanks for my work. Well, thank you. That's very nice. Let's see what else we can hit on quickly. MG Demore, do I think Kierkegaard's criticisms of Hegel were going in the right direction, or was Kierkegaard unfair to him in any way? I think that a lot of the time Kierkegaard is not criticizing Hegel as such, but criticizing the Hegelians of his time. He thought that Hegel was sort of like Socrates, kind of representing the best that philosophy that does not orient itself by faith, but takes faith as an object to use as a starting point, sort of content that has to be then philosophically developed. I think he thinks that's the best that Hegel can do. So, Kierkegaard can be pretty scathing at times, right? But I don't think he's being radically unfair to Hegel. But you should remember the Hegel's ideas by that time had really filtered through the philosophical establishment, and a lot of Hegelianism was not quite as advanced as what Hegel was doing. All right, Shady, what's your opinion about Albert Camus' philosophy? I like Camus quite a bit. Watergate, what Greeks do you think are important for understanding German idealism? I don't know. That's a good question. Why what Greeks? I mean, obviously Plato and Aristotle, because there's references to them. You probably don't need to know that much about Hellenistic philosophy, because the people in German idealism don't usually get the Hellenistic philosophers right or draw upon them that much. I mean, you could look at some of the pre-Socratic stuff, because there's references being made there, but I don't think it's really that important. All right, EB, what do you think of the work of Paul Ricoeur? I do like Ricoeur quite a bit. I think he's an underrated philosopher. I like a lot of the work that he's done. Dimitri, do I think numbers are discovered or invented? Some of them are discovered, I'd say, and some are perhaps invented. You think about well, it's tough to say. I mean, so think about I, right? The square root of -1. You'd be tempted to say, well, that's definitely invented, but it does get used in understanding electrical currents, so it's corresponding to something out there, right? So I guess that could be discovered as well. Matthew, have you read Martin Darcy's Mind and Heart of Love? I have not. Shenming Liang, can I elaborate a bit about a Nietzsche on the self? Yeah, there is a self, but it's way more complicated than we think, and it's not a unity. And what unity it has is some parts of the self imposing them on other parts of the self. And so, it's not as if there isn't anything out there that we can call the self, but it's a mess, All right, let me take maybe one or two more things. We're already a little bit over time, and I gotta get to work pretty soon. Of course, I'm working here. I've got a lot of things I have to do. Jordan Tahami, what do I see as the major differences between so-called Western philosophy versus Eastern philosophy? I don't recognize that distinction. It's not like there's a box of Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy, and there's so much stuff going on in just, let's say we take just the Chinese tradition, right? And we expand that to include Korea and Japan, which may be a mistake by itself, but and China also is getting ideas coming to it from the West as well, because of the Mongol Empire and all these other sort of things. There's parallels between different things, and I always avoid generalizing about Eastern philosophy or even non-Western philosophy in general. You think about how vast the Western philosophical traditions are, and then you start reading around in Chinese literature, and you realize that that's just as vast, and so is the same thing with the Indian subcontinent. So it's not. I don't think it's very productive to the West is rational and the East is intuitive. I think that's complete bullshit. There's plenty of people who make appeals to intuition in the West, and there's plenty of people in Indian and Chinese philosophy who are very rationalistic. So those sort of things don't usually hold up. Let's see if we can find another nice, easy one to go out on. So here's one, Montana Hovater. Is it really feasible to try to learn ancient Greek being a person that only knows English? Yeah, it's going to take a lot of work. You're probably at an advantage if you do not just know in the sense of being able to hear and speak and read, like having gone through Duolingo or any of these sort of apps, Rosetta Stone, but actually understand the structure of another language, having done things the old fashioned way with memorizing paradigms and learning, rules, and perhaps even doing some, as I did, comparative Indo-European linguistics. That really helps you when you go to study a language like Greek, which has cases that you need to learn and tenses and all these endings, and you don't know where the endings are coming from or why that's important, right? If you already know some Latin and German or some other things that you can compare to, it makes it easier. But it's not an insurmountable thing. I mean, there's books out there and courses out there that you can do. So, I think that can be quite helpful. All right, well, let me go out on this one then. Kyle Howie, would I be interested in exploring more art theory in the future? Benjamin's famous essay, perhaps, you're talking about the work of art in the age of the mechanical reproduction, or T.S. Eliot's Metaphysical Poets essay. Yeah, sure. But like everything else, it's dependent on the time that I have and what I'm currently teaching. Like I said, down the line, I'll be teaching a philosophical aesthetics class for Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. I'm pointing that way because it's over that way. It's about a mile from here. But until then, I probably won't be shooting videos on that stuff because I've got other stuff to do instead. Or I don't know, maybe I will. I'm not a big fan of Benjamin. I think that essay is kind of overrated, but people get a lot of mileage out of it. And I've shot a lot of videos on other philosophers who I think are overrated as well. So why not, right? All right, so I'm going to go out by actually saying just a little bit. We started talking at the very beginning about the Wisdom for Life show, which I co-host with Dan Hayes here in Milwaukee for River West Radio. You can see the link to it if you want to hear the first episode. It's up, it's available, and we're going to be doing that every second Friday. Well, every other Friday, rather. A little bit too much of a commitment to try to do it every single week. And we're going to be talking about how, philosophy can be applied to life. And we'll be drawing on a number of different traditions of philosophy. And hopefully people will get something out of it. I don't see anything else like this on the radio in the Midwest. So it's kind of a unique thing. And you can listen to it Fridays, 5 to 6 p.m. Central Time on the River West Radio site. If you're actually here in Milwaukee, you can turn it, to 104.1 FM and listen to it there. So, I'll put in a pitch too for River West Radio. It's a community radio station. If you're looking to throw a little money at something, you can always donate to it. They have a lot of cool shows. They make it possible for a lot of voices in the Milwaukee community to be heard that otherwise wouldn't get on the air. So if you're looking for somebody to donate to, maybe check them out. All right. So I'm going to sign off now. Thanks for all of your questions, and hope you have a great day or evening or night or whatever it happens to be where you are.